I often ask this question: why can't God remove my suffering? And I don't know where you are in your journey, but if you have suffered or you are going through suffering, there's this thing in us that wants to get rid of suffering. It's not natural for us to suffer. It's painful. It's difficult. It's hard. Um, and part of false belief that Christians believe is we are not to suffer. We are the children of God. We are not to suffer. And this teaching is wrong, and it's not part of the Bible. God ordains suffering for a purpose. For example, Job. He was considered one of the righteous man, but he suffered, and he suffered tremendously. And we could go back and look at this book. And people need to ask, why do we suffer? This is the main question to ask. And I hope looking at a few of the verses here helps us understand the suffering. First, I'd like to take you to Romans chapter 5, first 3 verses. The first chapter 4, he's talking about sin, he's talking about legalism, he's talking about religion, he's talking about depravity of mind. But chapter 5 begins with this verse, therefore, having been justified by faith. And that's basically the whole chapter 4, trying to defend justification by faith, that we are declared righteous before God by faith, by believing, not by works, not by the law. And sometimes we confuse with that. Like the whole chapter 4, he talks about Abraham and how Abraham was justified by faith. Abraham was not justified by faith right away. It took a couple of years later when he believed God's promises, and then he was justified by faith. And then a couple of years later, he was circumcised. And that's the whole chapter, looking at that. But here in chapter 5, he begins with this word, therefore, having been justified by faith. Like he's showing Christian experiences. Like if you're saved, if you're a Christian, this is the reality of your life. And first of all, he says you have peace with God. In the sense that this faith in God affects the way we think, the way we feel, the way we plan, the way we live, because Jesus says, if you want to follow me, deny yourself, pick up the cross and follow me. So our whole worldview has changed, our whole life has changed, our heart has changed, our internal person has changed. And that's because we have peace with God. There's a transforming effect to who we are. Second, he says we exalt of the glory of God. We boast of the glory of God, he says here. In the sense that this is a good boasting. There's always this person in a crowd who walks around and boasts about his money, his achievement, his strength, that he's better than anybody else. And you look at this, he has this car, look at that, he has this house, look at that, he has this health. And that's a negative side of boasting. But here he used the same verb, but he's describing here in the sense of boast in God, boast in God's promises, boast in what we are given, the revelations of God, the promises of God, that we are saved through Jesus Christ. And now we have peace with God. We boast in God. And the third thing he says is that not only this, but we also boast in our afflictions. It's kind of a strange way to look at this. Afflictions mean suffering. Like here he says, we boast in our suffering. Well, the question is, how can you boast in your suffering? Suffering produces depression. Suffering produces pain. Suffering produces sorrow. Nobody likes to suffer. As soon as we get a pain somewhere in our body, we run to ibuprofen and other pain medication to decrease it, to take it away. And there's this kind of idea in Christian circle: if you're sick, you find a person with a healing gift and let him pray over you so the sickness would go away. In fact, we don't see this kind of idea. In fact, we see that Christians do suffer. And they suffer sometimes hard and difficulty. And here he addresses the attitude of Christian suffering. Like when we suffer, we have this idea like, oh, if somebody could just take me out of my body, and I don't want to experience what I'm experiencing. It's so much pressure. And that's what he's talking about. He's like, Christians are experiencing pressure on them. It's like squeezing them. And that's what pressure does. That's what affliction does, suffering does. It puts pressure on who we are. It tests who we are, and it tests our faith. So here he says, we boast in our affliction. And the question is why? Like, maybe I read this incorrectly. Maybe Apostle Paul meant something else. But in fact, he did mean exactly what he wrote. Here he says, why? Further, he says, knowing that our affliction produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character. And character produces hope. So he brings truth, knowledge, worldview to explain why we suffer. Like, he says, if you're suffering, well, consider why it is there. I mean, it's not hard for God to heal us, and sometimes he does that. It's not God for God to remove our pain, and sometimes he does that. For example, remember Apostle Paul says, I pleaded with God 3 times to remove the thorn of the flesh, and God says, enough. God did not remove that thorn of the flesh, but there's a purpose in suffering. If I'm going through pain, if I'm suffering, if you're going through pain, if you're suffering, well, there's a purpose from God in having that suffering in your life. And what helps us go through is this knowing that it produces perseverance. Perseverance is another way to say is a certain spiritual strength to withhold the suffering. It's like to stand under pressure. That's what it means. To stand one's ground, not to be moved. There's a pressure on this person in order for him to break. And he says suffering, it develops spiritual strength inside of us. This endurance where we don't bend, where we don't break. And you could only achieve this through suffering. You know, often in our culture, people criticize that as soon as a person's out of high school or college, he goes out to the real world and he has a meltdown. And the reason is he's not used to the difficulties of this life. Parents are trying to guard this person. If whatever you need, I'll buy it. Whatever you need, I'll take care of it. I'll clean for you. I'll wash your clothes. I'll do everything for you. And then this person moves out of the house. He's like, this is difficult. I gotta figure this out on my own, because he hasn't developed certain kind of strength. So here he has the same idea, that when we suffer, whatever we go through, we grow in our spiritual strength. Like we grow in our endurance. We could stand under the pressure. This is very important to understand. Like, for example, when we suffer and the person doesn't understand the purposes of suffering, it's hard. His attitude is, get me out of this. His attitude, Lord, remove this from me. But when the person knows that God has a purpose in why I'm suffering, it becomes much easier. Second, this perseverance produces character. And character here in a sense of certain kind of traits, quality traits. There's a good character, there's a bad character. And often in our politics, the character of the politician is being scrutinized. He can't hold the office because of this and this and this. Well, here he's talking about character in the sense that the person's able to display certain qualities that a Christian should display. We could go to Galatians 5, the fruit of the Spirit: joy, love, peace, self-control, kindness, gentleness. Nobody excuses these qualities when we suffer. In fact, we don't think about them. When we suffer, we think, oh, get me out of this. I'm doing everything I can to get rid of this pain. I'm doing everything to get rid of this situation. But where often you think about, well, the spiritual qualities still need to be there. We still need to be joyful. We still need to have peace. We still need to be kind. In fact, when people suffer, what happens? They get loose in their temper. They explode. They yell. They scream. They make everybody else's life miserable because I'm going through miserable life and you're going to be going through miserable life. But a Christian ought not to do that, because he has the Spirit, or the fruit of the Spirit. And the fruit of the Spirit is on display when there's pressure, because it's not our strength. Our strength we give up, but it's His strength. It's God's strength. And interesting, he says, this is what affliction produces. It produces spiritual strength. It produces certain kind of qualities in our behavior, in our will, that God is pleased with. And third, he says, character produces hope. And he positions hope in the end. Like, here's your affliction, it produces perseverance, it produces character, and then hope. And it's like, why would he produce hope in the end? Hope is an expectation, and what God says in His Word will come true. For example, Jesus says, I will never abandon you. And whenever we're in a difficult situation, we feel alone. But the promise of God is with us. Jesus is with us. And that's why we have hope. We put our trust in that. But if we notice, hope is positioned in the and also hope is positioned at the beginning. At the end of verse 2, he says, we boast in hope of the God of our glory. More accurately, we in hope of the glory of God. So here he says hope is what goes through every stages of our life. We are saved in hope. We grow in hope. We die in hope. We are driven by the promises of God. We're driven by His Word. And this is important to understand, because our knowledge at that moment of our suffering, what we're thinking at that moment of our suffering, will affect the way we feel, the way we respond. And I have noticed people, when they go through suffering, they lose strength. They black out. They lay in bed. They don't want to get up. They don't want to do daily things like comb their hair, put on the clothes, wash. People don't want to talk to other people. And we're talking about people who claim to be Christians. Thus, we need to come back and say, okay, why am I going through this? When we know that if we suffer, if we're going through affliction, it produces perseverance. It produces God's character in us. And it makes hope more reliable, more true at the end. Then we could embrace, then we can boast in suffering. We could say, God is working with me. I'm not finished. I'm not done. God is trying to achieve me. I mean, if you notice in James, he says the same thing. I mean, and often if we don't know the scripture very well, we get very discouraged when we face various things. And he says the same thing in James 1. Chapter 1, verse 2. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that testing of your faith brings out perseverance. Here he looks at suffering from a perspective of, this is a test. If you're a Christian, if you believe and you follow Jesus, and the affliction in our life is a test of who we are internally. And I would say that if a person is not born again and he suffers, he falls away. He's like, I don't want this. I've been praying, God's not answering. I don't need this. But if a person is genuine Christian and he suffers, that is a test of his faith. And that is why he says, consider it all joy. Our attitude to suffering is joy, is boast, is rejoicing. God is at work with us. God controls our situation. God knows how much I need to suffer. And He's doing that for a purpose. And that purpose is for me to grow spiritually and for me to be like Christ. May the Lord straighten you. Whatever the troubles, whatever difficulties you go, they are not an accident. There's no accidents. There's no chances. They're specifically ordained by God in your life to shape you, to make you like Christ. May God bless you.